Hello and welcome to the Humans Invent Cycling podcast. I'm Richard Moore and I'm with my usual partners Daniel Freeb.
Good evening, Richard.
And Lionel Burney.
Hello, Richard.
Lionel, where are we tonight? Exciting new location.
What are we waiting for, Lionel?
We're in the Portman, the private dining room of the Portman, a pub in Marylebone in central London. It's a couple of hours until the annual Cycling Writers of Great Britain Christmas dinner. Anticipation.
Acronym, please.
Oh, so what's your
CWOGBAXD, I believe.
It's catchy. It is very catchy.
Yeah.
It's
copyrighted.
no WADA or
Trademarked.
USADA, is it?
It's not.
Anticipation as to who the mystery guest will be this year is
Feverish
rising
at this point.
Feverish.
The Humans Invent Cycling podcast. Interviews and analysis. We've got the big talking points covered.
So for the final Humans Invent Cycling podcast of 2013, we thought we'd mark the end of an era, really, by having a retirement special podcast. There's an unusually large number of prominent riders retiring this year, or have retired this year. And it really does feel like the end of an era. And I mean, Daniel, can you go through some of the names who are retiring this season?
Andres Kloden, one of my favourites. Juan Antonio Fletcher, Robbie Hunter, David Zabriskie, Christian van der Velde, Dennis Menchov, how could we forget?
Well, he retired mid-season, didn't he? But he's, yeah.
A few enforced retirements, I would guess. Danilo Di Luca. Stefano Garzelli has not been forced to retire, but he's retiring as well. Chris Horner could, and he's one of several who are still waiting for contracts, aren't they?
Yeah. You mentioned this last week. You mentioned it as a sort of watershed moment in cycling. Why do you feel that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of these guys came into the peloton in the late 90s. Some of them bang on 1998 when Festina happened, or just after Festina happened, and 15 years...
Festina being the Festina
doping scandal. 15 years have elapsed since then, and it's just interesting to look at what this generation represents to us as journalists and to fans of the sport, in terms of how they contributed or didn't contribute to what was billed at the time as, straight away, for instance in 1999, as the Tour du Renouveau, the Tour of Renewal, and 15 years later we still hear kind of epithets like that bandied around. Every tour, every season is a fresh start, and you wonder whether it's too much to say that 15 years and the whole generation has been wasted. And on an individual level, a lot of these riders, the really high achievers among this generation, have on the face of it a quite sort of glittering palmarès, yet have perhaps left will leave an imprint disproportionate to that palmarès in the kind of popular psyche. They will not be remembered with a huge amount of fondness. I'm talking about people like Andres Kloden, Dennis Menchov. Dennis Menchov is a Grand Tour winner. Would you agree with that? Yeah,
I mean, Kloden's the most interesting one in a lot of ways. Here's a guy who certainly didn't have any kind of retirement party, did he? That didn't stop Vanuka off either. But there's this. I mean, Andres Kloden has raced the last 5 or 6 years with an asterisk against his name almost. And you watch him, I mean, we were talking about him last week, and you worked a while ago. I think probably Kloden is the one who is most emblematic in a way of this era, if you like, and this sort of ambiguous reputation that he leaves.
Kloden typifies those riders who are going out on a fairly muted note, and it's been a very long swan song for riders like him ever since 2006, 2007, 2008. Not so much when they stopped winning races or they stopped being successful, but they stopped knowing how to interact with the public and the media, and Kloden's solution to that was to withdraw completely from the media. He stopped doing interviews in 2006, 2007, 2008, and almost by his own admission, and certainly by people who have known and ridden with him over the past few years' admission, Kloden really has been in it for purely selfish reasons and made no qualms about the fact that he has sought to earn as much money out of the sport as possible over the last few years.
I mean, you can get quite angry about the sort of irresponsibility of sponsors who hire riders as advertising billboards effectively and then allow them to carry on like that, to not interact with to not talk to the media, to not do any interviews. It's been a bizarre situation, hasn't it, really?
Although, on the other hand, I would suggest that consciously or unconsciously, teams will take that into account when they're negotiating contracts. So Cloden was perhaps not earning as much as he would otherwise have been earning if he had a higher media profile.
I mean, you did a profile on him in Pro Cycling a year or so ago, and your solution to him not talking was to interview people who knew him well and got to know him well.
Yeah.
And that was a fascinating profile because it did bring to life and tell us quite a lot about a guy that, because of his silence, we know very little about, really.
Yeah, he's had a very, very interesting career and an interesting background. The son of fairly wealthy parents from the former East Germany. I think his father was a fighter pilot, and burst onto the scene in 2000. The space of sort of 4 incredible weeks in the 2000 season, won Paris-Nice and Tour of the Basque Country. It was subsequently discovered that he'd also received a fairly suspect package, I think, in exactly that period, which may or may not have been containing doping products. But he was hailed immediately as the next Ulrich, because obviously at that point Germany was already beginning to doubt whether Ulrich was going to be the cannibal that they thought he was. There was talk of a huge contract with Once, a huge contract with Mappe, and very quickly Cloden started to underachieve. The problem with Cloden, he was one of these guys who was condemned by not even his talent, but the way he looked on a bike. I mean, he just looked fantastic. He just looked like, it made it look very, very easy. He was like Mercury on a bike. The way he used to move on a bike, it was just so fluid. A bit like Filippo Pozzato.
Yeah.
So
he always made Schleck, sort of that sort of very lean, sort of knees brushing the top tube.
And he was really in the wilderness for a few years, and the T-Mobile management lost confidence in him. I remember vividly talking to Walter Godefroot about him in 2004 when Ulrich was faltering in the Tour, and there was talk about whether Cloden would step up and be the team leader, and Godefroot said, there are guys who thrive under pressure, thrive when you make them leaders, and Cloden's someone who just crumbles completely.
And yet, 2004, that was the year he finished second to Lance Armstrong. Now, when Armstrong stripped of his titles, he has made the point repeatedly that the guys who were second should, in a fair and just world, step up and say, well, that Tour title is mine. That's not something that Cloden or anybody else has done. So what do we infer from that? What can be inferred from that?
Well, it's obvious what can be inferred from that, but I think the thing that damns Cloden more, really, is his implication in the investigation into what was going on at Freiburg University, where it was discovered that a number of the T-Mobile riders were going there for doping. And in fact, the story was that on the eve of the 2006 Tour, which was starting in Strasbourg, right on the German border, that some of the T-Mobile riders took a trip 2 or 3 days before the Tour started.
I think on the night of the prologue, after the prologue.
Right, okay, yes. I mean, the whole Tour was melting down under the weight of Operation Puerto that weekend, and yet, there's the allegation that T-Mobile was carrying on as normal. Jan Ulrich had been sent home, and Cloden was kind of like Teflon man, really, from that point on. And there was a court case in Germany which he paid money to basically. He had the option to pay a sum of money to make that court case go away, and I think that speaks volumes about Cloden's career and where we must place his impressive-looking Palmares. And I mean, I remember that 2006 Tour being convinced he was going to win it. I just felt that like there was something in the stars, that the Tour had this awful start, and Cloden was going to come through and be the man who would win a sort of farcical race. As it turned out, Floyd Landis was the man who won a farcical race
and then rescued it.
and then Oscar Pereiro, again, another rider who has an asterisk over a win already has an asterisk next to it. So Cloden is kind of, as Daniel says, sort of emblematic of an era in which sort of certain riders had this kind of boom and bust in terms of form. I mean, he won Paris-Nice and the Tour of the Basque Country in 2000, did virtually nothing for a couple of years. When his contract was running down, I think that was when he sort of had the fantastic second place in the Tour to Armstrong in 2004. And then, even 2006, 2007, he was in contention until a crash, I think, in the 2007 Tour. And even recently with sort of Radio Shack, often the moment that Cloden gets dropped in the mountains is kind of a sort of almost a watershed in sort of observing the tour, and sort of once, it sounds terrible to say, but kind of once he's sort of ruled out of possibly winning it, I do feel myself relax a little bit because he's such a
divisive.
Come on,
yeah,
there's part of
He's
everyone who wanted Cloden to win a tour in the last few years.
Well, yeah, but only in that sense of sort of almost a malevolent sense of like the tour almost deserving, or the sport rather, not the tour, but the sport deserving a winner like Cloden.
I mean, there's just, I think what struck me most reading your feature, Daniel, was the pragmatism stroke cynicism of his attitude, if those people you spoke to are to be believed, that it's so at odds with the sort of romantic ideals held up by the fans of the sport and others, that these guys are following their dream, following their passion, and that for the last few years Cloden literally has just been banking the check.
And I think if you look at the generation, the post-Festina generation and the Armstrong generation, I think the guys who thrived, who were able to thrive in spite of everything, were the guys who had that pragmatic relationship with the sport. If you look at cases like Pantani and Jimenez and guys who crashed and burned spectacularly, one recurring theme is they wanted
David Miller, even you could say.
They wanted to give the fans pleasure, and they wanted to excite people. They wanted to be feted by the media as well. And you think about Cloden now. I imagine in the next few years he will be invited to dinners. He will be invited to events. And
maybe even the cycling around in Great Britain dinner one year.
Maybe it's tonight. And he will walk into a room, I imagine, particularly in Germany, where a whole generation has almost been tarnished with the same brush and rubbished in a sense. He will walk into a room and there will almost be a same kind of muted note on which he's finished his career, and people won't really know how to react to him. And I think that's unusual for former sports stars.
Is, but he's gonna. I mean, but the point is, he doesn't seem to care. That's what we, and that's what. That's
he's learned to ride for himself, and I think his family.
He's going to retire to Switzerland. Probably never going to see him again. Are we going to? I mean, he's not somebody who's going to stay involved in sport, is he?
I think he'll recycle himself as some kind of equipment.
Run a sportif or something.
No,
I've no idea. I mean, what sort of role would there be?
Because his relationship with Germany as well was strained, to say the least.
Well, at one point he wanted to turn his back on the German Federation and ride for Switzerland, didn't he?
Yeah, and I think one sort of very, again, emblematic moment in his career, I think his first year at Leopard Trek, he was invited he was called onto stage at the team presentation, and all of the riders were shown on a big screen as they walked onto the stage with the flag of their country, and Cloden walked on with a European Union flag. He'd insisted that that was how he wanted to be called onto the stage.
Right. Well, we've spent a lot of time talking about Cloden, and I suppose he is. We were sort of dividing this up into heroes and anti-heroes, and I suppose Cloden is the most extreme example of an anti-hero in a sense, and we'll move on.
A willful anti-hero.
Yeah, and we'll move on in the next part to talk about, in inverted commas, heroes, and also introduce your interview, Daniel, with
Marco.
We've got
a few more anti-heroes to talk about.
We've got a few more to talk about, but we've got an interview coming out as well later on with Marco Pinotti.
This is the Humans Invent Cycling podcast with Richard Moore, Lionel Burney and Daniel Freed.
Any more anti-heroes that stick out for you?
Menchov?
Yeah, Menchov disappeared sort of mid-season, didn't he?
Again, a phenomenal record in Grand Tours, but will leave almost no mark in people's affections.
Ghost Rider.
But surely the most memorable moment in Menchov's career was falling off going uphill at Prato Nervoso in the Tour in 2008, was that?
I should say Stuart O'Grady as well, we didn't mention earlier, but again a guy who retired sort of mid-season, certainly emblematic of the era of, I think, 98.
Yeah.
I was recently watching some old footage of 98, and it was showing O'Grady's spell in yellow and his stage win, and they introduced the next day's coverage by saying, for once, doping took a back seat as Stuart O'Grady of Australia sprinted into the stage win. And of course he was named in the list of suspicious samples, and he subsequently admitted to having used EPO in 98. So there's a guy who's lived, that was really the start of his career on the road, at least. He was an accomplished track rider before then, but that was the start of his career on the road. An anti-hero for sort of a non-doping reasons, perhaps Robbie Hunter. Just because Robbie Hunter was such an abrasive character.
One of the most abrasive characters. Yeah. If there was ever anything going on in later years since the advent of Twitter, he would be relied on for some kind of inflammatory comment or to pour oil on the flames, so to speak. I just remember I can't remember the sequence of events now, but the 2007 tour when Michael Rasmussen was the storm was swirling around him, the story about the drugs being transported in a shoebox from America to Italy or whatever it was, and one of my colleagues at the time went and asked Robbie Hunter for as you do, for a reaction, and he said, just another bullshit story, and it was kind of like the absolute kind of unstatesmanlike comment you would expect. You would expect something a bit more diplomatic perhaps than that, but it was it's from the heart. I don't think you could accuse Hunter of not saying what he thinks at any time. And I think even when you look back at his career, the teams he's ridden for, a lot of teams, there's something about certain riders when they just keep getting a contract.
Very pragmatic.
But was able to do a job, and from what I gather from his time at in recent years at Garmin Sharp, he would be a reliable team member.
A very odd fit there, and yet quite a popular member of the team by all accounts.
But he would do the graft. I think that was the secret. On the days when he had no chance, he would. He would muck in and do the proper domestique work, fetching bottles and jackets and looking after Tyler Farrow when Farrow was a contender for stage wins. And it's always something always struck me about Jeremy Hunt, as a rider. Another very pragmatic person, someone who would sell his kit at the end of the year to kind of get a bit of extra cash. And sort of treated cycling as a living, which obviously it is, but perhaps more so than a passion. But he would always get a gig somewhere, perhaps by accepting less money than the next man or what. But he would always get a gig. And I think if you've done, as Robbie Hunter has, 14 years in the pro peloton, that's quite a significant contribution, really.
It is. Any other names stick out for you, Daniel? You mentioned
there are
Sandy Kazar.
A couple. Well, we'll talk about him in a bit later when we move on to talk about people who've made slightly more positive contribution than the likes of Claude, and perhaps positive.
Mikel Astroloza.
Or
Mikel Astroloza, another one.
Stefano Garzelli's one that people have not really talked about much. Again, a Giro d'Italia winner in 2000, famously kicked off the Giro d'Italia in 2002. And never really recovered from that, in the sense that he never spent a lot of time at major teams after that. He had a short spell at Liquigas, but kind of rattled around in small Italian teams for most of the latter part of his career. And again, someone who has a huge body of work as a cyclist. Points jerseys, mountains jerseys in the Giro d'Italia, but who will not be remembered perhaps with the fondness that they would otherwise have been
in a different era, certainly.
Yeah, and again, someone who didn't really know how to interact with the public and the fans when he came back from that positive test in 2002.
He kind of emerged in the slipstream of Pantani in a way, didn't he? And he even looked like a sort of bigger version.
Well, he emerged in 1999. He won the Tour of Switzerland between Pantani's Tour and Giro wins. So
98.
In 98. So it was very obvious. It was very easy to bill him as the next Pantani. And then Mappe were desperate, absolutely desperate. They tried to sign Pantani. They were desperate for the next Giro winner, or the next big Giro star. And they eventually signed Garzelli 2002. And I remember he rode just superlatively at Liège-Bastogne-Liège in 2002. They came over the line together, and then a week later at the Giro, the Giro started in Belgium that year and just had a barnstorming start. Looked as though he was going to dominate the race, and then was kicked out. He tested positive for probenecid, which was the same drug as Perico Delgado in 1988. And that was a strange case. There have been various theories about that in subsequent years. I think Tyler Hamilton suggested in his book that there were rumours of the time of an echo positive where Garzelli might have taken a blood transfusion.
And probenecid was a masking agent, wasn't it?
Correct. And when he reinfused the blood, it contained probenecid taken months earlier. Another theory was that his sample had been contaminated. There was a war going on at the time between Mercatone and Une Pantani's team and Mappe. There was talk of them putting something in their roast chicken in the hotel one night in Belgium. I remember speaking to Alvaro Crespi, the manager of Mappe, a couple of years ago about this, and at the time Mappe were adamant that Garzelli was 100% innocent and there had been some kind of sabotage. But Crespi, if you speak to him now, says he's not 100% confident that Garzelli didn't do anything.
And Garzelli, what are his plans in retirement, do you know?
Well, he's been married to a Spanish lady for some time and he lives in Valencia, but he's now going to be director sportif for what was Farnese Vini Fantini, and it's now, I think, going to be called Neri Sotoli.
And of course, De Luca is someone. But again, I guess we've certainly seen the last of De Luca this season, haven't we?
Yeah.
Another very emblematic figure of an era.
Yeah, and a hugely exciting rider, but obviously a hugely controversial rider.
I had an interesting conversation recently with Charlie Wigalius about him, because Charlie speaks very warmly of him really in his book Domestique, and De Luca's umpteenth positive test at the Giro this year was announced just as Charlie's book was published, and he did admit that he had a sense of dread that, you know, this would reflect badly. I think the point in the book is that he's talking about him as a team leader and nothing else, and that's where it's so interesting to get somebody like Charlie's perspective, because from his point of view, De Luca was a great team leader. He was clear in his instructions. He offered praise when he did well. He was very supportive. He really appreciated the work that was done for him, and so in terms of, from Charlie's very limited, very narrow perspective on doing his job, it worked very well for him, the arrangement. In terms of De Luca's numerous kind of doping infractions, he said it's a sad story. You know, this is a guy who cannot envisage life or being happy without being the protagonist at the Giro d'Italia. That's what he has lived for, and he could have retired a few years ago and lived happily with a fair amount of money.
And I think he's the child of his time, and his time in Italian cycling par excellence. I think De Luca, you could make an argument for him typifying how a certain group of riders was let down by particularly Italian cycling, because he was recycled time and time again and given chances by the federation. They picked him for the World Championships, given chances by teams, given chances by the public.
And the Giro is desperate as well for an Italian, a killer, as he was not. As he
De Luca, during his the penultimate ban, he was. He wasn't eligible to compete, and Rai Television had De Luca on their Giro coverage as a guest, and there was just, these guys were just indulged, tolerated, forgiven, let back in time and time again, and still hailed as the stars of Italian cycling. And what really needed to happen was that the first time they were caught, in De Luca's case, he was mentioned in investigations in 2001. Someone really needed to say, look, you either sort this out or you're not coming back. And Italian cycling reaped what it sowed in that sense. We'll talk later about Marco Pinotti,
let's take a pause there and come back and talk about some of some very different characters.
You're listening to the Humans Invent Cycling podcast, powered by Sharp.
Well, there's some other names there, Lionel.
As Daniel said, it is a kind of an end of an era of some kind. I was actually looking back just from a personal perspective really at my first full season covering cycling after leaving a local paper and joining a cycling magazine was 1999, and there's really only a sort of large handful of riders left at the top level who were racing then, among them Carsten Kroon, who's still at Saxo Bank, Davide Rebellin, Ivan Basso, Danilo Hondo, David Miller of course, Angel Vicioso, who is still with Katusha, Jens Voigt, and potentially Chris Horner if he does get a contract.
Jens Voigt.
Some doubt about that.
I think Jens Voigt rode his first tour in 1984.
I think he did for East Germany, yeah. But looking at some of the other riders who, just a run through of some of the other riders who are hanging up their wheels this winter, and one that I always sort of catches my eye is Nicolas Vogondi, purely because he was the French champion in 2008. And it's a day that, as British journalists, we probably remember very well because it was Mark Cavendish's first Tour de France stage win. But Vogondi was the last man of a three-man break who'd been out for a long time that day, over 150 kilometres, I think it was. And Vogondi was caught 50 metres from the line. And I've talked about it before on the podcast about that contrast between Cavendish and the joy on his face, and kind of Vogondi almost sort of forgotten by everyone except a few French journalists who for whom he was a story. So he was riding for a small Belgian team, Accent Jobs, last year, and announced recently that he hasn't got a contract for next year, and so he's calling it quits. Baden Cook,
the former green jersey
winner. The forgotten
winner.
green jersey winner, yeah. Locked in that very close battle with Robbie McEwen. I think Robbie McEwen writes in his book One Way Road, which was written by Edward Pickering in conjunction with McEwen, about the final stage of that tour in 2003, where Cook and McEwen were locked in a very close battle for the green jersey, and they were debating whether or not to sprint for the intermediate sprints, and for a while there, that was a tour where FDJ had a phenomenal tour. Brad McGee won the prologue in Paris, a fraction of a second ahead of David Miller, who dropped his chain on the cobbles because he only had one chain ring on his time trial bike. And then they defended the jersey, and then Cook got into the green jersey battle. And really, since then, it has pretty much been kind of a managed decline for Cook. Really, he's never come close to replicating that summer. Among the others, Christian van der Velde, of course, Garmin Sharp. He was one of the 5 men who was locked in that battle to try and win the 2008 Tour, and kind of was the first one to crack really out of the 5, wasn't he? Sort of his chance went on a more or less went on a descent, really, didn't he? He lost ground a bit towards the top of the final climb of the day, and then pushed it too much to try and get back on the descent.
Yeah, I think someone whose achievements will be slightly overshadowed by his involvement in the USADA doping inquiry, but a very fine domestique, and you talked about his descending there line. I think that is something that really conditioned and to a certain extent compromised his career at times. I know that he's really suffered in the last 3 or 4 years. He had a succession of crashes, particularly in major tours. I think he crashed out of the Giro twice in the last few years, and it was something that he really, really struggled with. It was actually a nice moment when Ryder Hejjedal won the Giro d'Italia, Christian van der Velde having given a key contribution, particularly I remember on the stage of the Stelvio, van der Velde went away in a break, and it was brilliant tactics by Garmin because it meant that van der Velde wouldn't have to negotiate the descent off the Mortirolo on his own, with the main group, and potentially be dropped. He could take it at his own pace, and that then proved absolutely crucial in the Valley, and that was kind of a nice sort of crowning moment to Van der Velde's career. But yeah, it's something that I think he's struggled with over the last few years, is descending and just being comfortable in the bunch generally. David Zabriskie is another one that kind of fits into the same category as Van der Velde, in that the later years of his career were marked by, first of all, a private acceptance of and a private admission to the Garmin Sharp management that he'd doped in the past, and then obviously the publication of the USADA report last autumn kind of put a cloud over Zabriskie's entire career as well, because now we look back at that almost miraculous day when he beat Lance Armstrong in the opening time trial of the 2005 Tour out in West France, when it was really one of those moments where
I followed him that day in the car, car.
It was an extraordinary result, really. It was everyone was focused on the pasting that Jan Ullrich was taking by Armstrong, and then somebody went even quicker than Armstrong. It was one of those sort of
overlooked,
shake your head moments, and obviously, that you can't look at Zabriskie's career without taking that into account. But also, he's an eccentric, really. He's a kind of, if we look at the way cycling, the sort of demographic of cycling in the United States, it probably appeals more to kind of slightly quirky, slightly geeky middle-class kids compared to in perhaps the European heartland of Belgium, Spain, Italy and France, where it's still a very sort of working-class sport. And Zabriskie kind of came to typify that, a man with a character that he didn't kind of keep hidden, and whether it was branding his own chamois cream DZ nuts or growing a moustache or just riding the way he rode. I mean, he won his Vuelta stage, the first Grand Tour stage he won after a solo break of 160 kilometres. He won a stage of the Giro, he won a stage of the Tour de France, and I just remember the 2008 Paris Tours where the Garmin team leader was Tyler Farrer, and they were going to try and set it up for a sprint finish for him, and one of the tactics was to try and put a couple of riders in the break to just keep the pressure off the Garmin team all day, and they did that. Zabriskie and Lucas Iser were the two riders who went in a small break of maybe 5 riders, and Zabriskie wore a skin suit, which for road racing even then was quite unusual. Long sleeve skin suit. Nicole Cook had done it in the Olympic road race in Beijing earlier in the summer, but there was a lot of
just very, very recently before that, really, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, a couple of months before that. So sort of in terms of kind of what Garmin, as they were then, Garmin Sharp as they are now, has kind of tried to push back at the technological sort of boundaries of the sport. Zabriskie is a sort of thinking man cyclist, if you like.
He never, perhaps too much of a thinker, he never seemed to fulfil his potential in a way as well, though I guess there is that question over what exactly was his potential if there are questions about some of his best performances, and that's the problem that we have with a lot of these guys.
I can remember standing in San Jose, I think in 2006 Tour of California, and watching on a big screen, watching him climb the very steep climb on Tour of California Sierra Road, and he was I think among the first 2 or 3 riders over the summit. And I can remember a group of us standing at the finish and saying to each other, "This is a future Tour de France winner," because it was only 7 or 8 months since he'd won that prologue, or the first stage of the 2005 Tour, and never showed anything like that kind of climbing potential again. Really.
Yeah, and was famously a roommate, a housemate of Floyd Landis in 2006 as well, which, again raised questions at the time, I suppose.
I think just tying up something that Daniel said earlier about De Luca and the role that Italian cycling and the culture of Italy has had with riders who pushed to perform and very much fated as real superstars. The expectation of the tifosi in the Giro d'Italia is to relentless, ceaseless attacking, and riders have to live up to that. And I think if you look at the way De Luca, as a kind of recidivist, basically never really changed his ways right up to the end, and Zabriskie is the other end of the spectrum. Probably, very few other teams would have allowed a rider who had had a performance like some of the performances Zabriskie had allegedly or probably doped, and then after a clean-up, not the same level of result. And very few teams would have offered a rider like Zabriskie a home. And I think when the criticism that Jonathan Vaughters attracts, we kind of lose sight of that a little bit.
That's why it's very difficult to be to even form an accurate or a fair assessment of his career.
Because it's really hard, isn't it? We all kind of, in all sports, we judge people by their previous performances, and anyone who doesn't live up to previous performances deemed a failure or somebody on the way down. And I think for Garmin Sharp to stick with not just Zabriskie but 2 or 3 other riders who have gone through that same career arc, it sums up the era just as much as De Luca's kind of repeat.
Can we move on from that? Yes. Daniel, you spoke to Marco Pinotti. Can you introduce your interview with him? What did you guys talk about?
Well, Marco Pinotti was like take 6. Marco Pinotti was a guy who started his career in the late 1990s, was primarily a domestique, fairly bog standard, was portrayed as a fairly bog standard domestique. No one really paid much attention to him until he took the pink jersey in the Giro d'Italia in 2007, and really came to attention then for his fairly outspoken views on doping at a time when it was omertà to the nth degree in the Italian peloton, and has built a fantastic second half of his career, thanks, he will say, to teams which allowed him to, enhance his performance in legal ways with technology, with science, with even down to visualization techniques, etc., and really developed into a statesman-like figure in the peloton, and will be sorely missed, I think.
So, Marco, first of all, tell me how your first few weeks.
I stopped riding and I had a week of holiday, and then as I came back, I started doing what is next for me next year, getting in contact with the riders I'm going to train, and planning a little bit with the team. I've been already with the team in Colombia and then United States, and then a couple of days in Spain for the training camp.
The decision to retire, it seemed as though you still had a fair amount to give. Your results were still pretty good in your last year. Are you not afraid that you've made the decision too early?
Yeah, I thought about it, especially after I recovered from the injury I had in early 2013. I had some good results, but despite from the results, I had very good feeling on the bike in the second half of the season. In the end, I could have done maybe 1 or 2 years more, but with the opportunity I have to join the coaching staff, which for me is a very good opportunity to learn and to give something to the rider. I think in the end I made a good decision.
Going back right to the start when you turned professional with Lampre, the first thing that sort of stands out in your palmarès is that you did the Tour de France as a neo-pro. You were thrown in to the 1999 Tour de France, a very famous Tour de France because it was the first one won by Lance Armstrong. It was also the first one after Festina, yet you survived. What are your memories of that tour?
Very good memories, because for me it was first year as a pro, and I was called to do the tour, I think less than 10 days before the race starts. So I didn't know what to expect, and the goal that the team asked me to do on that tour was only to finish. We started with 9 riders, we finished all in 3, and I was one of them. For me it was, and I finished without never being in trouble, or never being afraid of not to make the time cut, or I was always comfortable, never be in the top, but not even in the last part. So that moment I was like more relieved, because the longest race day I did before was only the Giro Baby, and actually if I was confronting, I was surviving, like you said, better the Tour de France that the Giro Baby as an amateur. So for me it was a good point where I thought maybe I can make out of a good career as a pro. If I look now after 12 years or 15 years, when everything came out, and now I can think that I could have achieved a lot more in those years in the tour if everyone else would have played by the rules. I was very satisfied on that tour, and had very good memories. And but now if I look back, you can see that cycling has been going through a process of cleaning himself and getting better. The second part of my career, I had the best of my results.
When people talk about that tour, and people have talked a lot about 1999 in the last year or so because of the Armstrong scandal, people have said 99% of the riders were doped. Doping was completely endemic. You also rode for an Italian team. Italian cycling in that era perhaps wasn't the most healthy culture. You must have been aware that people were cheating, no?
Yeah, I was kind of aware. It was not something that it was on the paper every day, but you had the sense of people, especially after Festina affair, you had the sense of people like being worried of what Festina brought as a new way of quoting the cheater. You didn't know who was doing what, but since there was no test for EPO, it was common to suspect other people were using stuff.
On the surface, Marco, in those years, up to 2007, 2008, it seemed as though Italian cycling was very, very successful, dominated the world cycling to a large extent. Yet, we can look back now and say that it was actually very unhealthy. Would you agree? And was part of the problem that Italian cycling was too complacent. It didn't take the doping problem seriously. Teams let riders who had been banned back in. The federation didn't do enough, etc.
I don't know if the federation didn't take enough seriously, but because maybe 2006, 2007, the CONI, Italian Olympic Committee, the federation, they were one of the forefront of the doping, the fight against doping. But for sure, those years, they have a big, a bad effect on, on what we have now. Probably we have lost. As Italian, we have lost those years to develop, other methods of training to look into, because those years were like some of the results were obtained by people who we found out later they were cheating. So in the end, this was the result was like a fake result, and now we're paying the price now because cycling is in a bad state because we lost those years. We missed the foundation of nurturing, of the way how you nurture a rider, or the way how you educate them in training, and all the basics that the rider need to know to be successful.
And your career seemed to change in about 2007. That the sort of watershed moment was probably when you took the pink jersey in the Giro, and that sort of signified a moment when your career had changed and cycling had changed as well, because Operación Puerto had happened and new controls, the whereabouts system was about to come in, etc. It was almost like a eureka moment for you going into a team, T-Mobile, that was working on enhancing performance legally, and that was an environment in which you thrived.
End of 2006, Bob Stapleton came in, and with the new ideas, new mindset, and he set up this environment, T-Mobile. Everybody, I was feeling at home. From 2007, I had a very, very, very good year, and then year after year, I improved a lot, and it was, they were, like you said, exploring all the way to improve the performance legally, like setting up realistic goals for the riders, a good calendar, a balanced way of training, and all giving the best material for time trial. So you could see that those teams were like one of the first, or maybe a way of working that has been imitated later on. So we set like a new way of working, and I was very proud to be part of the team.
And just last thing, Marco, if we talk about memories of your career, what would be your fondest memory, and then also just the person who most influenced your career?
So the best memory I had is the Olympic Games in London 2012. I did both time trial and road race. The best memory is like being at the start of the road race. We were in the front line with the Italian team, and the first 10K I was very, I was speechless and breathless going outside London from Buckingham Palace to South London. Was very, very emotional. 10 kilometers in the race before the race really starts, especially because Olympic Games, because of the atmosphere, because of what they meant for the sport, and because and going 2012 at 36 years old, I was, canceling regrets that I have for not being selected in 2008. I thought they deserved the place in 2008, and being there in 2012 was also a way to delete those regrets. And the person who influenced me the most with my career, I think it was Omar Beltran, it was my former trainer, which I met I started working with in the end of 2004, and I wish I could have worked with him earlier, because it teach me a lot of things, and how to think only about myself and not look for alibi or other excuses doing this job.
The Cycling Podcast with humansinvent.com. Innovation, craftsmanship and design.
So that was Marco Pinotti, Daniel talking to Marco Pinotti. We have a competition winner, finally. Graham Galvin correctly guessed that the mystery voice was Pinotti's boss, Andy Rees. Bad Santa.
That was a good clue in hindsight.
Yeah, it was a good
clue.
It's amazing it took a long time for people to get it. So I think the prize was a copy of Sky's the Limit, a copy of Inside Team Sky,
A copy of the Cycling Anthology 3.
Volume 3. Was that it?
Something from David Walsh.
Something else as well. I'm sure there was another prize. Oh, Mark Cavendish at Speed.
Really?
A copy of that.
Did we offer
Daniel,
that?
you've been appointed to secure a copy. So Graham Galvin, if you could tweet Humans Invent at Humans Invent and let yourself know, and we'll arrange for delivery of those books. Can't guarantee it'll be for Christmas. In fact, I can guarantee it won't be for Christmas. But early in the new year, you'll get delivery of those books. Okay, let's wrap up this retirement special with discussion of another couple of riders, Juan Antonio Flecha and Sandy Cazar. Flecha.
Well, Flecha, Spanish classics rider, which is something of a rarity, certainly when he kind of broke through. Obviously,
Argentinian
Oscar
Spanish.
Yeah, Oscar Freire was a similar, sort of had a similar leaning towards the classics, but more of the Milan-San Remo World Championships, Amstel Gold, whereas Flecha was a proper cobbled king, really. And I think if he'd had a sprint finish of any note, he would have won a sack full of those races, because of the number of the times he was on the podium, at least once at Tour of Flanders, I think third.
Several times at Paris-Roubaix.
Several times at Paris-Roubaix. One Het Nieuwsblad or Omloop Het Nieuwsblad.
He won it one year.
Won it 1 year, and on the podium another 4 times, I think. But because he didn't have the sprint finish to beat the likes of even Cancellara and Boonen. I mean, think of the Grand Prix E3 a few years ago when the three of them were in the break at the end. Flecha was the one who had to do all of the moving because he knew he would not beat either of them in the finish, and so that shaped every single tactical decision he had to make. It meant he burnt his matches perhaps a bit too soon into the finale. He didn't have that security of thinking, well, I'll leave this for the last 400 metres. Nevertheless, just a really thrilling rider to watch.
Aggressive. Great attitude.
A great attitude. I mean, just think back to the 2011 Tour on the stage de Saint-Flour, where the France Television car carrying some VIPs barged its way through on a narrow tree-lined road and pinged
them off.
Flecha and Johnny Hugeland into the ditch, and Hugeland obviously got all of the kind of headlines because he landed on the barbed wire fence and got cut to ribbons, but Flecha went down pretty badly as well and was bashed up, but made nothing of it really. He was very sort of statesmanlike about it. He wanted to deal with it on a much more kind of private level, go to ASO, the Tour de France organisers, and talk to them about what had happened and not make a public fuss. And I think that sums up his character.
I would have liked to have seen him win more, if only to see his victory celebration, which we saw at the Tour. What year was it he won a stage? 2001?
2003, I think.
Sorry,
it was the centenary
with
tour.
With the old arrow, because of course his name means arrow in Spanish. I just have one little anecdote about Flecha, which is actually in my Sky's the Limit book, but in 2010, I think this sums up his attitude to racing. Always very positive, always very aggressive. They were having a disastrous Tour Team Sky the first year at the Tour. Bradley Wiggins was not performing, and they were seeking sort of consolation, feeding on scraps. And there was one stage in the Pyrenees, it might have been the Tourmalet stage in 2010, a misty stage, I remember, where Andy Schleck and Alberto Contador eventually rode away from everybody. But at the team meeting that morning in the bus, they'd been encouraged to attack, and one of the other riders in the team, a British rider, was expressing his displeasure at this instruction because he felt that it was getting them nowhere, that they were just wasting energy and being made to look like fools, really. And he went off to the toilet. When he came back, there was a post-it note on his chair, and Flecha had written, "You will leave your balls on the mountain, or you will not get back on this bus." It's an interesting insight into the kind of racing character.
Yeah, another one. I was on the 2011 Dauphiné, which Wiggins won. I'm pretty sure this is the right race. And now the team meeting was being given by Sean Yates, and he was talking through the various kind of tactics of what was going to happen. It was a mountain stage, but the first 50 kilometres, say, was going to be on big roads, meaning wide roads, which meant that there would be a lot of attacking going on because there'd be opportunities for riders to attack on the left and the right hand side of the road. And Flecha just interjected with a simple tactic, but just to keep it together with a high pace on the big roads, and then on the small roads let something go away because there'd be fewer opportunities for riders to jump across, which would make the break too big and too unmanageable. So, a real kind of racecraft about him as well. And as a Spaniard, his English was excellent before he joined Team Sky after years with Rabobank, and he fitted in well in that team. He had a good sense of humour. That he was just it seemed to be very
and
well.
He's gone surfing now, has he? He's going to spend the rest of his retirement surfing.
Not sure.
Well, he's a bit of an outdoors guy.
Yeah.
Takes off in a camper van. He's got a place up in the Pyrenees. Goes skiing there and surfing in the. Surfing in the Pyrenees.
Cavendish, something that he always says about Fletcher is he was a great guy to have as a teammate, but an absolute nightmare for everyone else in the peloton, because he's someone who takes absolutely no prisoners. Will go for any gap. Quite vocal in the peloton and just a bit of a pain.
Sandy Cazar.
Well, we talked about riders sort of almost personifying and being emblematic of a generation, and Cazar, I think, was really the poster child of a French generation who had really been burned quite badly by the Festina scandal. And really, if you look at the French teams that survived in that era, it was solely thanks to the Tour de France. They were not getting results. There was a kind of a collective persecution complex. They felt that they talked a lot about cyclisme à deux vitesses. They felt that others were doping, that they weren't, and they just became depressed. And Cazar always looked depressed. He looked depressed for 10 years, from about 2002 to 2012. And they were just taking a kicking every day. There's a very good documentary, a fly on the wall documentary, about the 2004 Tour de France in the Française des Jeux team. And every morning, the film crew shows the Française des Jeux team, they're like inmates on death row. Before every stage, they just know that they're going to get an absolute battering every day, and they somehow have to find some crumb of comfort, some crumb of motivation to go to battle every day. And there's one particularly vivid image in that film of the stage to La Mongie in 2004, and it was a mass cull by Armstrong. It was a mass slaughter. US Postal drove hard from the bottom of that climb, and all of the other general classification contenders fell off one by one. And Tyler Hamilton was one of the riders who surprisingly fell off the back very quickly, and we subsequently found out it was because he'd had a dodgy blood transfusion the day before, I think. But we see Marc Madio, who's the Française des Jeux team manager, in the car, encouraging, screaming at Sandy Cazar, "Go on, you're doing fantastically, you're almost there, you're almost at Hamilton." And the camera shows Hamilton, and then they show Cazar, and Cazar is pounding the pedals. He's sprinting up this mountain. It looks like he's delivering the performance of his life. And then we've got Hamilton, who's a few hundred metres up the road. He looks like he's riding through treacle because he's had this, this,
or very thick blood.
This very thick blood, and that really put in perspective, the dopers who were having absolutely disastrous days, and Cazar, who was probably, like I say, he was on the ride of his life, and yet he was still hundreds of metres behind him on the first mountain stage of the Tour. And that puts in perspective what a struggle it was for these guys.
But Sandy Cazar was also a rider who had his great moments. I remember his stage win in 2011 in particular, which came on the chain gate stage, I think, when Schleck was distanced, and he won after the Col de la Madeleine, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I think he eventually came
forget that. It wasn't.
It was
the Ballet.
It was a few years before that.
Yeah, forget that, right. But Sandy Cazar was a rider who had his moments as well. Stage wins in the Tour de France.
I think he finally accepted that he was never going to be a general classification rider for whatever reason. And we've talked before about what a special performance it is for anyone to get in a break in the Tour de France and then convert the chance. And Cazar did it on a few occasions. I remember also the 2006, I suppose his best performance as a general classification rider, 2006 Giro, probably one of the dirtiest Grand Tours of all time. Basso won by 10 minutes, he won by 20 minutes from third place, and Cazar was, I think he finished 6th in that race, but again, just a monumental struggle for him the whole 3 weeks there.
That was when he gained possibly 12 minutes in a break, I think, wasn't it? And I think, again, that's one of the things about Cazar was that he was their nominal Grand Tour team leader for a number of years, in almost the same way that Moncoutier became for Cofidis, and yet they were never going to really contend for
there was a glass ceiling.
Yeah, they weren't going to contend for a high finish, but similar to Moncoutier, who retired at the end of last year, very rare that a rider will go through an entire career for one team and one director sportif. He's Française des Jeux or FDJ Point.com as they've been at certain points, and Mark Madio, and that as well in itself tells you where French cycling was. They lived for the Tour. Everything was built around the Tour, and he was their most reliable rider. And if he had a bad July, the entire team had a bad July.
And again, a bit like what we were saying about Garmin Sharp and a guy like David Zabriskie being, if you want to say, indulged or at least allowances made. I guess you could say that Mark Madio did the same with Sandy Cazar.
Yeah, I think it did give them...
realistic in his expectations.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the problems with that generation of French riders was they had a ready-made excuse. There was a widespread perception that everyone else was dope and they weren't, so therefore... if they didn't perform particularly well, people could always point to that. On the other hand, I remember in Strasbourg in 2006 when Opération Puerto broke and Basso was kicked out of the Tour. I remember a French journalist, a colleague, had been to the Française des Jeux hotel that day, and he said they were just euphoric because they thought that finally the dam might have broken and finally some kind of equality was going to be established, because they'd struggled for years by that point.
Meanwhile, Claudie and friends are driving to a blood bank. Anyway, that's a good note upon which to leave this retirement special, I think. Hopefully we've covered the careers of
We're about to retire to the pub, aren't we?
We are. Well, they're setting up the tables for the Cycling Writers' Dinner.
Hence the
in our next podcast, we'll report back on tonight's Cycling Writers' Dinner and maybe have an interview with tonight's mystery guest. But we'd like to, end of the year, thank everybody for listening. We've had a fantastic response to these podcasts, so thank you very much for all your very kind feedback. So thank you very much, everybody, for listening. That has given us the green light for next year, so we'll carry on next year with a weekly podcast, daily at the Tour, perhaps more regularly at the Giro as well. So thank you very much, and thank you. We should thank Nigel Brown at humansinvent.com, who does a great job of supporting us and publicising the podcast. Jasper Credland, our sponsor at Sharp Electronics. Thank you, Jasper.
And John Mooney, our editor as well, yes, who edits out the swearing,
the pauses.
Yeah,
like that one. So thank you very much. Thanks, Daniel.
Thank you, Rich.
And that's a great Christmas jumper.
I was hoping we were going to edit out the Christmas jumper, the reference to the Christmas jumper.
Daniel, so what's your name again? Lionel. Thank you, Lionel.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Richard.
The Humans Invent Cycling Podcast. For more articles, go to humansinvent.com/cycling.